Dude, we went to this new Indian restaurant yesterday, and like it was fucking great while we were there, but then I had to wake up like 2 times in the middle of the night, just like, fuck. What is happening, guys? Matt August in the house. Today, I'm gonna help you overhead press better. This video is the 10 most common overhead press mistakes. We're gonna start really general and go over some of the mistakes that it seems like most people make. And then once we get towards 8, 9, 10, we'll get a little bit more technical for some of the more advanced. But we'll see, let me get this bar up right here. The most common mistake with the overhead press is that a lot of people press the weight not vertical to the ground. So you'll see people pressing the weight, especially forward. And what this looks like is generally something like this. Like that, and there's usually quite a bit of movement, but if you check this out from the side, you'll see that they're usually pressing it somewhat forward. So it'll start above their shoulders, but they're kind of punching it forward, okay? And you could usually get away with doing that with some really lightweight like this, but you never really see anyone pressing some serious weight. Your strength's not gonna be that good if you are pressing the bar forward. Really, the bar path should be perpendicular to the ground, meaning just straight up and straight down. Definitely never forward. You typically don't get people pressing it too far back. Mostly it's people pressing it forward, but really just press it straight up. And that's mistake number 1. The second most common mistake is that people will do a push press instead of an overhead press. They're really similar, but they're 2 completely different exercises, and I'd recommend training them as different exercises. So typically you'll have people do overhead press like this with their legs, but that's a totally different movement. If you're gonna be doing overhead press, keep it strict. So it's 2 totally separate things. Obviously, the best way to increase your overhead press is by actually overhead pressing. The best way to increase your push press is push pressing. So remember, train what you want to get better at. So if you want to overhead press, do the overhead press. Don't do the push press. All right, so this next one is where we start getting a little more technical. Let's talk about grip. I feel like most people use a little bit wider grip than what they really need. And the reason why that is a lot of people will jump over to the overhead press and use their bench press grip. But for a lot of people, you need to have a little bit narrower grip. And for most people, here's about shoulder grip. For me, in terms of directly in front, what you want to do is slightly wider than that. So for me, that might be somewhere with my thumbs, around 1 digit past the knurling into the smooth. Sometimes I like to do a little bit wider like this, but typically I'm not much ever wider than that. For the most part, when you're doing your overhead press, you want your elbows to be underneath your wrists, if possible. What's up, bro? Ideally, you don't want your elbow and your wrist to be at an angle like this. You'll have a much better force transfer for a strict overhead press if your elbow is directly underneath your wrist. All right, guys. So for a lot of people, what that means is having a slightly narrower grip. So what you'll see is a lot of people overhead pressing like this, when really they're probably much better off with a grip that's a little bit more narrow, but still slightly outside of shoulder width, like this. All right. All right, so the next mistake I see people make is their elbows, but really that's your shoulders too. With this exercise, you don't want to approach it with the same kind of elbow flare that you might with bench press. That's where a lot of mistakes are made. People take their bench press form and they'll try to basically do the same thing with their overhead press. With the overhead press, you want to have external rotation in your shoulders, which means the elbows coming forward a bit, being tucked a little bit. And what this does is it'll give you a stronger pressing position at the bottom, and it'll be much, much safer and healthier on your shoulders. So from the side, this is how a lot of people press when they're doing overhead press. It's a big mistake, is you'll see them press with the elbows almost like behind the bar, right? Like this. But really, especially at the starting position, you'll find that at your starting position, if anything, you could have your elbows in front of the bar, but then when you press, your elbows will be underneath the bar. But there's a certain point where you can't bring your elbows any further out this way, you'll drop the bar. But still, a lot of people have their elbows too far behind and too much internal rotation, and they need a little bit more tuck, like that. So more pressing like this with the elbows starting in a more forward position, tucked position. And then as you press, naturally your shoulders will internally rotate a bit back into a natural position. You don't have to keep them tucked the entire time like this. That's not natural, right? As you're pressing it up, your elbows will track outward into a natural position, but you definitely want a starting spot that is strong and powerful with your elbows slightly tucked. And once again, remember what I said earlier, elbows underneath the wrists and hands, underneath the bar. If your elbows are out to the side, you don't really have a good joint stack. But if your elbows are tucked more, you have a much better, nice straight line joint stacking of the barbell and all the other joints. So that's another mistake. All right, so this next major mistake, it relates with some of the other ones, but I see a lot of people pressing outside of their center of gravity. So especially from a side view, what the bar should look like it's doing is being pretty much above midfoot or slightly behind midfoot where your center of gravity is. Remember with lifting weights, it's always about like, where's your center of gravity? Bar path generally, especially squats, deadlifts, and so on, following that center of gravity. But for the overhead press, remember, take the other tips, slightly narrower grip than a wide one. Medium-ish grip just outside your shoulders, elbows slightly tucked. What you see is a lot of people have the bar way forward like this. It's really common, and maybe even their elbows are fine, but if you saw this from the side, really, I'm not above my center of gravity. And a lot of people could, you could still press it straight up and straight down, but it's out of my center of gravity. So what this means is, typically, the bar needs to be a little bit closer, resting on top of your clavicles for a lot of people. So, right here, nice and above my center of gravity. Okay? Not like this, and obviously not like this. So typically you'll have people with the weight forward of their center of gravity, and that puts a lot of just bad stress and pressure on your shoulders. You don't want to have that. You want it to be above your center of gravity. So this next tip, and as you guys can see, a lot of these mistakes are really interrelated. With this next tip is you'll see a lot of people approach the overhead press just completely neutral in terms of where all their joints are, in terms of their torso, hips, and everything, which is great. But with the overhead press, since we want the bar above center of gravity, pressing perpendicular to the ground, what you want is a little bit of chest up, right? You want your shoulders down, chest up, a little bit of a thoracic extension in that mid-upper back. Not so much in the lower back, but you see sometimes people make a mistake of pressing with a really big arch so that it can stay above their center of gravity. You don't really want that. You kind of want from here to here pretty much where it is, but you want to arch that upper back, shoulders down and back, chest up. That way you can have a safe pressing position. So I'll show you what that looks like real quick. Okay. So if I'm keeping my shoulders down and possibly even forward, it's harder for the bar to stay above center of gravity. It'll typically be in front of your center of gravity. So if I kind of tuck my neck like that, keep it nice and close to my clavicles, chest up, shoulders down and back, and of course, it requires you to slightly move your head out of the way. You can press it straight up, and then let your head go through, just like that. Okay? As opposed to what you see a lot of people do, even if their bar is above center of gravity, perpendicular to the ground, none of this, okay? Where it's a lot of pressure on my lower back, too much overarching, which What you want is pretty much those hips and glutes to be flexed and staying where they are. Chest up, thoracic extension, and press. Okay? All right, so this next tip is about execution and bouncing your reps, bouncing your repetitions. What you see a lot of people do is, even if they're doing everything else perfectly, bring it down and they just they're treating it like a continuous exercise, which isn't necessarily bad, but if you really want to work on your pressing power from the bottom and explosiveness and get better at doing the first rep, I'd recommend coming to a dead stop. You don't necessarily have to chill here for years, but typically I'd recommend a split second to maybe even a full second dead stop between reps, so something like this. It's gonna be safer for you here in the long run. A lot of people might call me out, Matt, but you sometimes do bounce reps, and that's true, that is true. But for the most part, when I'm trying to build my strength with a given exercise, I'm usually doing what I would consider like perfect repetitions, right? Just perfect repetitions in practically every single way. And then when you go to test your strength, that's where you may give yourself a little bit of wiggle room, right? And typically the only time I might ever bounce the rate or not come to like a solid, respectable pause at the bottom might be if I was going for like a 5 to 10, a new 5 to 10 rep max PR, something like that. But typically when I'm going for like lower rep PRs, I'll pause. But yeah, the only time you'll see me bouncing anything is if I was trying to go for like a new fucking world record. But yeah, for the most part, guys, don't be bouncing your reps, all right? Train, it's common sense, but not really common, because always remember, you want to train what you want to get better at, right? So think about it. If you have sloppy form, sloppy execution, like, is that what you want to get better at? So think about what you want to get better at and train it that way. All right, so this next mistake is that a lot of people aren't using a full range of motion for whatever reason, right? A lot of people think like, if I'm able to keep constant tension, that's going to benefit me the best, so on and so forth. Maybe skipping the pause, whatever might have you. Perhaps you'll see a lot of people training in the bottom range of motion, which this is probably the most typical, right? You'll see people pressing it like this. You very atypically see people pressing into the top range of motion. That's more common for like dumbbell pressing. But you know, like I said, train what you want to get better at. Use a full range of motion if you want to get better at the exercise as an exercise. You know, some people think, oh, I want to keep tension on my shoulders because the top range is triceps. Like, no, like don't get swept up into that kind of mind of thinking, because typically it's going to have you training in like minimized rep ranges, and it'll end up most likely contributing to your eventual very likely injury that will end up coming along when you're not training most movements with a full range of motion. It's going to be different if you have like an injury that requires you to do certain things, but if you're capable, if you're able to, use a full range of motion. Okay guys, just be smart. I mean, like, think about it. Is it better if I use a full range of motion or not full range of motion? Is it better if I like say it slowly and common sense will just kind of like ring out to you, okay? All right, so this one is really ego based, right? A lot of times you'll see guys going for a new PR or whatever it might be. They're just in their, a lot of people just do this in their regular training. In fact, I'd say this is a very common mistake people will make, is to start off a set, hit the first, you know, 50% or 75% of reps perfectly, and then as you get more tired, as it gets harder, you'll start throwing in some leg drive like that, and that's cool and all for exercising, but I take it if you're watching these videos, you're here to motherfucking train, right? Are you here to train or exercise? So remember, training the push press will be great for increasing the push press. If you want to really train and get better at the overhead press, do the goddamn overhead press. So don't be ending sets with extra leg drive. It's not it is not going to help you build more strength, because training and hitting failure and going beyond failure, because technically that's what that would be doing, push pressing beyond your overhead press capacity. Training and hitting failure or moving past failure doesn't necessarily give you any more benefits than training just before failure. Okay guys, there's no extra benefits. You're increasing your risk factor. It's not necessarily going to help you build any more strength on the overhead press, okay? So instead of doing that, just train to about, for the most part, train to about 1.5 or maybe 1 rep in reserve for most of your sets. Every once in a while, okay, you're gonna hit failure, so be it. But for the most part, you don't want to train completely to failure for the goal of hitting failure necessarily on overhead press as a compound movement. And you definitely don't want to hit failure with strict press and then start doing bounce reps with leg drive on a push press. That is not going to make you a better overhead presser, all right? All right guys, so this last tip, or this last mistake, it's common with like most exercises, and that's a lot of people aren't really focusing on their core stability, not really focused on keeping everything nice and tight. So with the overhead press, the mistake you'll see a lot of people make, combined with all the other mistakes, too much lower back arching, pressing it forward, bounce reps and all that, is that your core, typically for most people, it's not tight and solid, right? So you want to make sure that you keep your core tight, your glutes flexed, not like 110% flexed, but engaged enough so that your core is balanced on top. Feet can be anywhere between hip and shoulder width. You usually don't want this. You usually don't want a staggered stance. Basically, heels underneath my hips to shoulders, somewhere in that area, but keeping all of this nice and braced, as if someone was gonna punch you in the stomach. So breathing into your stomach before the rep, pressing it, and then breathing out, either on the way down or before beginning the next breath, the next rep. So core tightness, super important. Remember, this is like a really strict, badass exercise. You want to treat it as such. You don't want to treat the overhead press like it's some sort of like burnout builder, burnout fucking CrossFit. Treat it like a badass compound movement, because it is one. So kind of like going in with that last point, I was talking about frequency, and throughout the entire thing I was talking about, if it's a deliberate goal of yours to like increase your overhead press, you're gonna have to put some thought into how you train it. You have to put in some, at least 1 time a week frequency. My program 753 is actually what I'm doing right now. I'm about to hit 7 sets of 5 with 180 pounds right now. And with my 753 program, I have people hitting the overhead press at least once a week. Optionally, it can be done twice a week. But what I usually have is the overhead press once a week, and I'll have like a dumbbell press usually once a week. So you're hitting, vertical pressing twice per week. And that could be one good way to go for increasing your overhead press. Another thing I didn't even mention in the tips and all that was varying the rep ranges, and that's kind of more of an advanced tip, but varying the intensity rep ranges. For example, today I'm just hitting 80% of a training max at 225. My actual max is definitely above that, but in my 753 program, I have people begin with pretty lightweight so that they can get the form down over a couple cycles, starts increasing the weight, and the program starts getting hard when you're a few cycles deep, and then it's insane once you're like 6-7 months deep. It gets really tough. But like I was saying, varying the intensity of your training can also help you build strength more than just keeping it exactly the same. So last week I did 7s. I did 75% of my max, or my training max, for a set to 7. Today I'm doing 80% of my training max for sets of 5. The next time I train overhead press will be 85% of my training max for sets of 3. So that's just one way to kind of vary things. All right guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you haven't already, please do subscribe, Give me a thumbs up on this video if it has helped you, and it really does help the channel, by the way. So that's it. I'm actually gonna hit some overhead presses now, and you guys will have seen them by now, probably. So let's go.